Jazzcast Pros.
Assemblyman Meeks, thank you so much for stopping by.
Thank you.
So since I have you in the studio, I have to ask, did you support the legalization of marijuana in New York State?
Yes, I did. And
Yes!
Yeah, and I recognize it as, economic justice as well as racial justice, because when you look at the challenges that we've had as it relates to the breakdown of the black family and the Rockefeller drug laws and how so many of those things hurt our community, it's about time that we do something to try to refute and make things better.
Now we're giving you an opportunity to have a legal business. I mean, why not?
Yes.
I'm hearing there's some talk about kind of like a stop and sniff situation. If they stop and what's that in your car, even though marijuana and cannabis is legal in New York, it's legal to possess, but you're not allowed to smoke it in your car?
Similar to like drinking and driving, right?
But what if you're a passenger?
If you're a passenger in a car, in a motor vehicle, and you have an open container and you're drinking, that's grounds for the vehicle to be pulled over and stopped and searched and all those other things. I would suggest that one do it in the confines of their home. When you look at the rules and the guidelines, it will be similar to cigarettes. So you cannot smoke cigarettes in public, places as far as restaurants, places of business, and so on. So that will be the same rules. So as it relates to going to the concert and, lighting up a spliff, that's still illegal.
Right.
Yes.
Welcome to Women in Cannabis, the podcast to help you, the budding entrepreneur, profit and grow in New York's marijuana industry. My name is Shaina St. John, and my mission is to help women navigate the politics around this evolving economy so that you can legally serve the cannabis community. For decades, the Black and Brown community here in our own hometown of Rochester, New York, has been passed over when discussing equity. The disproportionate value of disinvestment in those communities throughout New York State can now be reversed. Cannabis offers an opportunity to create true generational wealth. We just have to ensure we are always moving it forward because we don't want to be creating more disadvantage to our community by going backwards. Join me this episode to hear how New York State's policy influencers, lawmakers, and entrepreneurs shared at the Greater Rochester Chamber of Commerce's event, Cannabusiness Capitalizing on the Cannabis Economy, plan to see marijuana and equity through. This is very powerful. The changes that the legalization of a former narcotic with now a known and accepted medical use is here to provide racial and economical justice throughout New York State.
Welcome to Women in Cannabis, New York edition, a weekly podcast for women in cannabis that will help you navigate the politics and plug into the resources you need to cultivate and grow as an entrepreneur, supporter, or consumer of cannabis culture in New York State. Hosted by your cannabis coach, Shaina St. John, a certified medical marijuana pharmacy technician, an advocate for breaking the glass ceiling in corporate cannabis and reinvesting in communities devastated by cannabis criminalization. This is our cannabis. This is our culture. This is Women in Cannabis Podcast.
Okay, so on May 12th, myself and my producer, Jazzy, of Jazzcast Pros, we had the opportunity to take some time out of our day and attend Rochester's 2022 cannabis event. And the topics were centered around entrepreneurs and businesses and creating equity in the community and getting updates from the Office of Cannabis Management as to what's coming next. Now, as Jazzy and I sat there, we had the opportunity to meet with everyone from the business owners to magazine writers, editors, an array of amazing, informational, inspirational, resourceful people that were in that room. Such power was in there that day. And it was an experience I'll never forget. It was my second cannabis event that I attended in total since going off on my own and working on my own project and my own business, but the first event that I attended this year in 2022. And it was extremely useful and beneficial. Jazzy and I were able to retain some pieces from that event. And we knew we were going to have a lot to sit down and digest after that. And it's been weeks since I sat in that room there, and I'm still digesting things from the conversations that took place from the event that day. I just ran into someone in the mall that was digesting the event through the news interview that they got to see on Channel 10 that Women in Cannabis gave. And so for this episode, I just want to sit down and share some sound bites and some pieces from that day. One of the first pieces of audio, our Senator Jeremy Cooney, he spoke on the effect that the change in administration in Albany had when Cuomo stepped down and we obtained a new governor, Kathy Hochul.
We have a new governor. And so what we're finding is that some of the issues that had been negotiated into the MRTA document over the last 10 years that were ultimately adopted into state law, there are new regulators and policymakers that have different perspectives on how we create the equity that all of us really are hoping to see as our colleagues in OCM roll out the applications and such. We just want to make sure that we're really doing everything we can to learn from those states that have come before us. So to answer your question more directly, I think that there are some real issues when it comes to social equity and how we make this a vibrant market.
When Cuomo came in, he came with his squad. And so when he left, that squad might have gone too. And when Governor Hochul came in, her squad came in. I don't know why it didn't occur to me that Pandora's box may be reopened to some things that Cuomo and his team had already defined when they wrote MRTA. And from what I read, MRTA didn't just happen overnight and then get turned on March 31st, 2021. He had been working on that for a very long time. He had been straightening things out and taking pieces into consideration from all around the state as people submitted things to him and his team in regards to the legalization of cannabis for the recreational side. We're talking about building equity and reclaiming reparations. I don't know if it's the proper word for society, if society cares for me to use that word, but in my opinion, I see that this is how we will get reparations. That's why I use the word reparation. But rebuilding homes, reconnecting families, establishing a solid ground in a home in the Black and brown community so that they may move forward from something that tried to and successfully set them back for some time, the war on drugs, the overcriminalization of the Black and brown community via the war on drugs. Hear what Senator Cooney had to say.
There's a piece of legislation that was entered into the New York State Senate and in the Assembly just this past week that would allow law enforcement officers at all different levels to be able to stop vehicles with which they smell cannabis and go through a chemical test, right? Those are some really serious concerns that were negotiated in the MRTA that are now starting to kind of slip back. And so we need to have a real conversation about what that enforcement, we have to manage safety first and foremost, but we can't let it go back to where we were.
Hear what Senator Cooney had to say. And so when Senator Cooney said that there was talk of basically it's like stop and sniff, it made me think of stop and frisk, that if an officer pulled you over and they smell it, their little human nose, they just smell it. They want to have the right to stop and search. And my first thought was, there's so many of those little car scent fresheners out there that smell like some of the terpenes that are found. I've smelled several terpenes. And there are car fresheners that smell like it. There are, and if it's legal to have at home, if you can possess up to 3 ounces of cannabis and up to 24 grams of concentrate, if someone was at home and they had flour in their possession, and they used it, and that smell traveled with them, as Jazzy mentions, and that smell comes with them from their home into their car, and now an officer's pulled them over and they smell it. Then what? And so then Senator Cooney makes a statement, and he says that these were some of the things that former Governor Cuomo and the team had already straightened out and situated in MARTA. These were things that were already brought up, already discussed, already debated upon, and that was done. And then when the new team came in, when the new governor came in with her team, they reopened some of those pieces, and that is one of them. We're talking about removing the stigma of marijuana and righting wrongs of overcriminalizing the Black and brown community so that we may build equity in those communities all around New York State. And now you want to stop and sniff? To me, that feels like we're going backwards. And so Jazzy had a second in the studio to catch up with Assemblymember Desmond Meeks and to hear his voice and his support for the legalization of cannabis was great, and it was awesome. I look forward to hopefully getting to sit down with him one day. I was also asked one day, okay, so if someone pulls you over, and I think it was a retired cop that asked me this at the dispensary one day. If a police officer today pulls you over, how are they going to know what your levels are? How are they going to be able to test for it? And my response that day was, well, they will need to implement some sort of technology. It was very interesting. It was very interesting to hear Assemblymember Desmond Meeks's inference as well on the solution to that. So if you just take the time to hear a little bit of that audio, we'll share that with you right now.
It gets a little sticky if you were in your home. Mm-hmm. It's on your clothes. Yeah. The cloud of smoke followed you into the car.
Yes.
And now you're getting in trouble because they stopped and sniffed you.
Yes.
And there's really no way for the cop or for the passenger to prove whether the smoke was in the car or was it in the house and the cloud followed you into the car.
Yeah. You have some in law enforcement that's trying to push the button on this. And the reality of it is when alcohol was legalized, it took another, 15 to 20 years before you had a breathalyzer, So, I mean, when you look at that, I mean, it may take time before there's an actual test. But as far as passing the law, we saw it as the right thing to do at the right time.
During our day, we also got to hear from New York State's Majority Leader Peoples-Stokes. I enjoyed listening back to her audio because she shares my biggest interest in common with me in regards to this plan. You can still have an adult use license with a medical marijuana focus. And I loved to hear Majority Leader's Stokes' take on using the word recreational use versus using the word adult use. I use it interchangeably throughout the podcast just so that everyone knows that it means the same thing. But I do personally like to say adult use as well. And it's related to the fact that, one, I come from the medical marijuana side of the legalization of bringing cannabis here to New York State. As it was introduced that way first, and then with adult use. It helps to cover public safety as well. Take a listen to New York State Assembly Majority Leader Peoples-Stokes and what she had to say.
These are Black people, these are Black doctors, and this is what they do. They're going through HBCU colleges and to help those folks understand how to get engaged with this plant from a wellness perspective, not from a recreational perspective. You might know that I will never say recreational use because I don't consider it that. I think it's adult use. It's adult use, and it's either adult use, much like you might have a martini after work, or it's adult use because you're using it for wellness. No one under 21 should be using this unless by orders of a doctor.
And just because you have adult use license doesn't mean that has to be your focus, just recreational, right? You can, have a medical focus, a wellness, a therapeutic focus. and still apply for, adult use license. Like I said, it's just that you don't have to, go to a doctor that's not embarrassed and a $150 registration fee in order to go buy cannabis, right? That's the whole thing with adult use. So
Because before I even began to think through entering the cannabis industry through my own business ventures, I always thought to myself, and when I would be asked by my coworkers as a technician, I always said, I never want my business, I never want Shaina to ever forget cannabis's medicinal use. And as long as I do that, as long as my business and I, as long as we do that throughout everything I create, I will always enforce and ensure public safety. And that's always been number one to me as a technician. And it will remain number one to me as an entrepreneur in the cannabis industry in New York State and as I grow and take this outside of New York. And then our majority leader, she also used numbers that said something extremely powerful about bail reform. And then I want you to think through the changes and what the numbers are going to look like as the expungement program continues to roll out.
If you just think about the amount of money that New York State has saved since this law was implemented, and we began to expunge people's records. We began to stop arresting people for low-level marijuana possession. We began to allow people to use a plant legally. It's immeasurable. I want to give you some numbers just from New York City. So arrests for drug possessions and low-level drug selling in New York tumbled from 107,848 in 2009 to 22,969 in 2019. That's a lot of people who are not in jail, not having their lives negatively impacted, not having to stop the job, not having to figure out who's going to watch the kids while the mother is working. That's a ton of people who can stay at home, maintain their livelihood with their families, and maintain their communities. That's just arrest alone. And because there have been changes in bail reform, you can't even hold a person in jail until they have bail money to get out, which is respectful because all you had was a nickel bag of marijuana. Why should you be in jail for 2 months waiting to cut a deal to turn somebody else in before you could get out just because you don't have whatever the amount of the bail was? That's saving the state a lot of money. On convictions for these same offenses, it shrunk from 32,919 in 2009 to 6,000 in 2019. That's a big drop. And when you look at that drop in numbers of impact on lives, imagine that drop in the impact of public costs that goes into incarcerating them and dealing with their children after they have had the loss of a parent.
She says, and she sees the opportunity that we now have to do things the right way, to no longer be incriminating and over-criminalizing people for doing things that everyone else had already been doing.
So all of this is an opportunity to change the way we do things in America so that we're not incriminating people for things that everybody does. And that we're allowing people who have been criminalized to reap the benefits like everybody else has always had. It's just that simple.
During that day, we also had the opportunity to hear from the Office of Cannabis Management, and we heard from the Executive Director, Christopher Alexander. So he hit some pain points and some frustrations that I've been asked about since I've started the podcast. I mean, I was asked these questions before I started the podcast, but now as the rules, regulations, and everything comes about and how to become licensed is out there, oh my goodness, the amount of frustrations that the conditions have brought has been wild. But the executive director, Christopher Alexander, took the time to break that down for us. Tune in next Friday as I share answers to the question I've been asked since this event by individuals in and out of New York State. That question being, well, what can you do to enter the industry if you don't meet New York State's requirements by the OCM. Thank you for sticking with me today as I recap my day at this year's Roc Cannabusiness event, capitalizing on the cannabis economy. I broke down some of the takeaways and insight that was provided by New York State Senator Jeremy Cooney, Majority Leader Peoples-Stokes, Assemblyman Meeks, our MC for the day, Kaylin Kostetter, and the Office of Cannabis Management's Executive Director, Christopher Alexander.
The war on drugs has impacted too many families, taken away too many of our husbands and sons, and left many Black and brown communities broken and in poverty. But now that marijuana is legal in New York, there's an opportunity for us to claim reparations, rebuild our families, and create generational wealth. This is our cannabis. This is our culture. This is Women in Cannabis Podcast.